Hello everyone once again, and welcome to this drop-in mini session from the Levy Library. This is Author's Rights. My name is Carrie Levinson. Hello. I am the Reference and Instruction Librarian at the Mount Sinai West and Morningside campuses. So we have a pretty packed agenda to go over in 30 minutes. So I'm just gonna go right into it. Once again, if you have questions, please type them into the chat. But if you can wait until the end, I will have a question and answer session at the end. But if you have burning questions that you have to know the answer to, I will be checking the chat box as we go along. Okay, so this is our agenda. We are gonna go over copyright basics, your particular author's rights in publishing, journal options when you are getting ready to select journals to publish in, journal policies for open access and self-archiving, and negotiating with publishers. So first of all, copyright basics, because you can't have author's rights without copyright. And the first thing is to know what copyright is. This comes straight from the US Copyright Office. Copyright is a form of protection provided by the laws of the United States for original works of authorship. Generally, copyright is owned by the person or people who created the work. And copyright is a bundle of rights that is all together. So these are the rights to reproduction, distribution, public performance, public display, and modification of the original work, which is also called the derivative. And as I said, generally these are owned by the people who created the work, but there are exceptions. The first exception is if you created a work in the course of your employment, then the copyright belongs to your employer. The second is if you are an independent contractor and the work is designated as made for hire in the contract that you sign, then whoever you sign the contract with is the copyright holder, and it's not the independent contractor. And the third one, which probably seems pretty obvious, but I do have to mention it because the consequences surprise a lot of people, is if you sell or give away your copyright, you no longer have it. All right, so that's the general basics of copyright. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about how long copyright lasts. So when we're talking about copyright, we are referring to the Copyright Act of 1976, which was amended in 1998. And it states that works that were created on or after January 1st, 1978, because even though it's the Copyright Act of 1976, it didn't go into effect until 1978. It states that works that are copyrighted for the term of the author's life plus 70 years. So if there's one author, then it's for the term of that author's life plus 70 years. If there are joint publications, then it's 70 years after the last surviving author's death. And for works for hire, as I mentioned before, or anonymous works, this is 95 years from the first publication or 120 years from creation, whichever is shorter. And rights can be transferred or terminated. So if you have assigned rights to someone or an entity that is not yourself, you can terminate them. But this is quite complicated. So if a copyright owner transfers all their rights, that's called an assignment. When only some rights within that bundle of rights are transferred, then that's called a license. And we're going to talk about licenses more in depth in a few minutes. But for what you should know now is that there are exclusive licenses, which means that only the licensee can exercise the rights that are granted by that license. And there are non-exclusive rights, which means that others, including the licensee, can exercise those rights. with terminating rights, why would you want to terminate rights that have been assigned? So we're not talking about terminating your own copyright. We're talking about terminating rights that were assigned to someone else. You can only do that after a period of 35 to 40 years. And yes, it has to be within those 35 to 40 years. It's a very complicated process. There's a whole hierarchy of things that you have to take into account. And if you miss that window, then you miss it forever. And we're not going to go any more into that, but if you are interested more in that particular section of copyright law, you can look at Section 203. So this is a whole lot of numbers and factoids. Why am I spending so much time on this? This is to tell you that copyright lasts for a really long time, and it's very, very difficult to get those rights back if you give them or sell them, if you give them away or sell them. So that's why I am talking about this, to really hammer home that point. So this brings me to your rights in scholarly publishing. Do you know your rights? A lot of people are very shocked at what rights they do and do not have when it comes to scholarly publishing. In traditional publication agreements, all rights, including the copyright, go to the publisher. And if you have signed one of these, you're probably like, yes, I know this already. But what does this mean? It means that if you want to reuse, for example, a section of a paper you wrote, or you want to reuse a table or an infographic or something that you made, you have to ask permission from the publisher. A lot of people are very surprised about this. They think, well, I wrote the paper, I created this graph. Obviously, I can do whatever I want with it. Not if you give away your copyright, because then you don't have the right to do that. The publisher has the right to do that. The same thing goes for distributing the work or placing it in a repository or your personal website, because once again, we're talking about the rights to things like reproduction, distribution, modification. All of these are within that bundle of copyright. And so if you give away your copyright, you don't have the right to that anymore. So what do you do if you're faced with this? Maybe you didn't realize this before, but now you want to know what you can do. You want to know what options you have, what kinds of rights you can retain. Well, we're going to get into that. There are several ways to go about this. So the first thing is choosing journals that will give you a little bit more leeway in what rights you can either retain or what kinds of licenses there are. And the summary of this is going to be, there's going to be some kind of open access option. So open access means that the material is freely accessible and available to everyone. It's not behind a paywall or a subscription as soon as it's published. And gold or diamond open access journals allow you to do this. Usually they are under Creative Commons licenses, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. But they allow authors to retain more rights than they usually would. If you are not either comfortable or you want to go with a publisher that does a more traditional publishing model, you can also take a look at the policies for journals that let authors self-archive. And this is also called green open access. So we have a lot of different color options here. And these allow retention of some rights, even though in a traditional publication arrangement, the journal or the publisher is the one who holds the copyright for the article. And I should also mention that we're generally talking about journal articles here. So copyright covers lots and lots of different kinds of works, but for this particular session, we're really just focusing on journal articles. Journal selection tools like PubSub or Jane will allow you to sort by open access options. There's a whole session, a whole drop-in session that's going to be given in July, I believe, on journal selection, so I'm not going to go into this, but it's good for you to know that there are tools that can help you with choosing this option. So I mentioned Creative Commons licenses before, and when you are talking about open access, you are going to see Creative Commons licenses. So what these do, remember we talked about licenses before where non-exclusive licenses allow both the licensee and other people to do things with an original work. And that's what Creative Commons licenses do. So the authors generally retain their copyright with Creative Commons licenses, and they're not given to the publisher, but other people are allowed to do things with the work in addition to the authors being able to do things. So, and generally that's, as you can see from this chart, that has to do with either commercial purposes, using things for commercial purposes, or allowing others to make derivatives. So the one that you are going to see, and in fact, this particular chart is licensed under a Creative Commons license, which is this license, the CC BY license. The CC BY license is the least restrictive of all of these licenses. It means that as long as you attribute the author, so all of the Creative Commons licenses require that you attribute the original source or the original author. So as you can see here, this chart was created by Jill Sarasella. So I'm attributing the original source here, and you also have to put the license that the work is under. So as long as you do that, you can, for the CC BY license, you can use it for commercial purposes, and you can also make modifications as long as you tell people what the modifications are. And there are various other restrictions that can be put on work. So this is the most restrictive license. This is the CC BY NC and D license, which means that you can't use the work for commercial purposes, and you also can't make modifications on it. So basically what you can do with a work that has this license on it is distribute it. So various open access journals will use one of these licenses. A lot of the time you'll see the CC BY license, but you may see one of these other licenses as well. I'll just go over what share alike is. So this is by SA, which means share alike. And that means that if you do make modifications, you are allowed to make modifications. But if you do, then you have to license your derivative with the same license. So once again, the author is retaining their copyright here, but they're being nice and they're letting people do various things with their work. So Creative Commons comes into play a lot when we're talking about open access and when we're talking about self-archiving. We've talked about open access, and we've talked about gold open access really, and Creative Commons licenses. But what if you, once again, want to go back to the traditional publication model, the traditional publishers, and figure out what their journal policies are for self-archiving? And what self-archiving is the author depositing a free, or posting, depositing is basically posting, a free copy of their article online in order to provide access to it. So that distribution right is really where self-archiving comes into play. And there are a couple of great tools that you can use, but first I have to talk about article versions. And what are article versions? So journals have a publication process, as you might be aware of, and an article goes through a lot of stages before it gets published in a journal. And versions of that article are the ones, certain versions of that article are the ones that are allowed to be self-archived. So certain journals will allow certain versions of articles to be self-archived or to be posted somewhere, and will not allow other versions of articles to be posted or to be distributed. So these are preprints, postprints, and final versions. And I'm going to go into what each of these is. So this is a preprint, this is a postprint, and this is a final version. And there is quite a bit of difference. These are 3 different articles, so they're not. It's not the same version. Excuse me. It's not the same article in different versions. But this is generally what you'll see when we're talking about these types of article versions. So a preprint, which is the one all the way on the left, once again, is the version of an article that is submitted to a journal. So it hasn't been accepted yet. It hasn't been put through the peer review process. It hasn't been copy edited. It doesn't have the formatting on it. It looks a whole lot like a Word document, doesn't it? That's because it is, or whatever word processor you use. This is basically the version that you submit to a journal and you hope they're going to accept it. The second version, the one that's in the middle, is a postprint. It's also called an accepted manuscript, and it's also called an author manuscript, as you can see over here. They're all exactly the same thing. And what a postprint is the version, as you might have gleaned from the different name accepted manuscript. It's the version that's been accepted by the journal, and eventually it's going to be published in its final form. So this is the version that's been peer reviewed. It has not been copy edited. It has not been formatted. So the publisher hasn't put all the bells and whistles that they're going to put on it quite yet. And this particular example is a little bit misleading because it comes from PubMed Central, and PubMed Central likes to put its own formatting on postprints. But this is not because it's a final version. It's because this is what PubMed Central does. But as you can see, they have really clearly stated that it is an author manuscript and not the final version. So a final version, which is the one that's all the way on the right here, is also called a publisher or published version. And as you might figure out, it's the version that you expect to see in a journal. So if you open up a PDF for a journal, it's the version that has been peer reviewed, it's been copy edited, it's been formatted, it looks great, it's very polished and professional. That's the final version. And I'm going to tell you right now that publishers don't generally like their published versions being freely accessible unless they're open access. So this happens to be an open access article here. So this is a gold open access journal. So once again, you see that CC BY license at the bottom of it. But for traditional publishers that do not have open access, they, as you I'm sure have seen, they don't generally like their final versions being distributed willy-nilly across the internet. So the versions of the articles that you can share, that you can self-archive, are generally the preprints and the postprints. And this brings me, once again, to those tools that I mentioned about how you can figure out which version you can use when you want to self-archive. These are the 2 databases that really do a good job on this. The first one is called Sherpa Romeo. Yes, it's a silly name, just go with it. The second one is called Transpose. And Sherpa Romeo has, I think, over 4,000 journals or publishers listed in it. So it's a pretty big database. It's pretty good about the policies of the big publishers like Elsevier and Springer, Wiley, Taylor and Francis, all of those. It may not have the teeny tiny independent publishers. So in that case, you may have to actually contact those teeny tiny independent publishers to see what their journal policies are. But Sherpa Romeo has a lot of them listed, and we're actually going to take a look at it in just a second. And Transpose is the newer database that has preprint policies on it, as well as policies for newer types of peer review, like open peer review and co-reviewing. But because Sherpa Romeo has preprints, postprints, and final versions, we're going to take a look at that right now. Okay, great. Okay, so this is the Sherpa Romeo database. It is a freely available database. You do not have to go through the Levy Library to access it. And all you have to do is type in a journal title or ISSN. So I'm going to do JAMA. And it shows me the Journal of the American Medical Association, so I know I have the right one. And it shows you who it's published by as well. And so it has what you can do in terms of self-archiving for the versions that I mentioned. So remember, I mentioned that there are different names for different things. Submitted version is the preprint, accepted version is the postprint, the published version is the final version. So once again, these are exactly the same thing, they just use different names. And we're going to start off with the preprint here. So JAMA is actually pretty strict about how they allow preprints to be used. So they don't allow them at all. So you cannot put your preprint on a preprint server if you want to be published in JAMA. They just do not allow it. For the accepted version, they are a little nicer, but only a little bit nicer. So these do get a little bit complicated. Essentially, what this means is that you can self-archive your postprint or accepted version on PubMed Central, and that's only if it's required by the funder. So what that means is that if you have gotten a grant from the NIH, which mandates that works that get funded by them go on open access repositories like PubMed Central, if you are in that position, then your article is going on PubMed Central after a period of 6 months. So in this case, JAMA will do it automatically. You don't have to do it yourself because this is a mandate. But this is a fairly standard policy for journals. So the accepted version, the postprint, is usually the version that journals are willing to allow to be self-archived. So let's take a look at the published version policy. And JAMA is actually pretty lenient in their policies in that it's the exact same as the accepted version. So they're okay. Once again, as long as you get a grant from something like the NIH, if it's required by the grant maker or the funder's policy to put it on an open access repository, then it's going on the open access repository after a period of 6 months. I will say once again that this is a little bit unusual. A lot of journals will not allow the published version on a repository at all. So JAMA is very strict with preprints, but pretty nice with published versions. But once again, this is a pretty standard policy for accepted versions or for the postprints. And the postprints are generally the ones that you're going to be able to see. And I see that there is a question. They might, yes. So the question is, what if I put a preprint on medRxiv and then the paper got accepted in JAMA? Will JAMA ask to remove the preprint from medRxiv? They might ask you to do that, yes. Some policies will actually state that explicitly. So they'll say you can put the preprint on a preprint server like medRxiv, but once it's published, it has to go away. So I would say that JAMA is a little bit more strict here. because they're explicitly saying no open access is permitted for this version. In this case, I would ask them about medRxiv. That's a very good question. Thank you for that. Okay, so once again, this is Sherpa Romeo. Very good for big publishers, big journals. Not as good, but they're getting better at smaller ones. Okay. Okay, so you've looked at journal policies. Maybe you're going to go with an open access journal, but maybe you want to negotiate. How many of you knew that you were able to negotiate? A lot of people don't think that they're allowed to, but it is an option. So first of all, let me just say, before signing a publisher agreement, please read it. A lot of people are really excited at the prospect of publishing anywhere, or maybe it's your first publication and you just want to be published anywhere and you don't care what the conditions are. I am going to say to you, please don't do that. Please read a contract before you sign it. And this goes for any kind of contract that you have. Please read the agreement carefully. Think about what you might need to use your work for in the future. So, for example, for future publications, once again, I mentioned that if you don't hold the copyright and you want to reuse a section of your work in something else, you might have to ask the publisher for that. So think about if you want to retain that. If you want to use your work in teaching, something like that. So you can modify and cross out the language for rights that you want to keep. And what rights should you keep? That is entirely up to you. No one can answer that but you. Maybe you want to transfer the copyright, but get non-exclusive publishing rights. Maybe you want to keep the copyright and transfer limited rights to the publisher. So you can modify the language on the agreement and to what you would like to retain. And I mean, I'm going to tell you right now that if you say, no, I want to keep everything, the publisher probably isn't going to be so happy with that. But, you know, think about what would be reasonable for both parties and see what they say. If you are not comfortable with actually marking up the agreement, you can add an addendum. So there is something called the SPARC Author Addendum. SPARC is the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, and they've been at this a while. So they have an author addendum that you can put on the bottom of an agreement, so it attaches to the agreement, and it essentially does the same thing as I just talked about with you deciding which rights you'd like to retain and putting that as an addition to the boilerplate agreement that you're being asked to sign. And so SPARC has that, and Science Commons has the Scholars Copyright Addendum Engine, which also has a tool for the SPARC Author Addendum and additional tools if that's not exactly what you want to use. You can also ask for permission after publication. For example, if you want to post on your own website, you have your own personal website, you can ask the publisher if you're allowed to do that. You know, try it out. And also, as I mentioned before, consider open access publishers so you don't even have to bother with the negotiating. I do want to just say this, however. So a lot of people are very afraid of negotiating because they think that a publisher or a journal will never accept their publications again if they try, if they don't just accept the standard author agreement immediately. And that's not true. So there's something I want you to keep in mind. Journals don't exist without people writing for them. And if you have been accepted by a publication, they want your writing. They think you have something of value to offer. So they're not going to just outright reject you after they've accepted something that you're writing, because they don't have content if people don't write for them. So you have more power than you realize, and I want you to keep that in mind. Okay, so now we've talked about negotiating, we've talked about journal policies, we've talked about open access journals, and so you know how to get, you know what is allowed for your particular journal. Where do you go if you want to self-archive? There are a few options for that. So you can go with a subject repository, and I will just say that a repository is an online archive of documents. So Open Door is a directory of global open access repositories on many different subjects in many different countries. OAD is the open access directory, and they have a list of discipline-specific repositories. And these two, well, medRxiv was mentioned before. bioRxiv and medRxiv are preprint servers, so you can place preprints on these, and these are a little bit more specific to the Mount Sinai community. I do have one caveat. So you may have heard of ResearchGate or academia.edu. These are not repositories. These are academic social networks, which are not the same thing. And some journals, some publishers will have different policies for them. So a lot of people think that they act like repositories so that they can post their work on them, and that's not the case. Some journal policies will actually say you cannot put your work on ResearchGate or academia.edu. So please double check before you do that, because you may be violating their policies. Okay, so I just want to mention some of the drop-in mini sessions that are coming up. So there is an introduction to preprints that I will be giving on June 23rd. And that journal selection class is on July 16th. And of course, there are many other great sessions that are probably going to be of interest to many of you. So please feel free to sign up for any of them. And now I will take questions, and I see that there is something. Oh, that's just a thank you. Okay. Are there any other questions? I know I just threw a whole lot of information at you. So in the email that comes after this session, there will be a link to our LibGuide on authors' rights. And if you have not absorbed everything that I have said today, a lot of that information is on that guide. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me or contact the library. And thank you very much for joining me. Have a great rest of your day.